Now we're going to be taking a look at creating an entirely custom plant, and we're going to be painting it entirely. So I'm going to go up to File, New, and I'm going to create a 2000 by 2000 image. And we want to make sure we're using a high resolution, so in case we do need to do some close-ups, we don't need to worry about going back and recreating our image. I'm just going to change our thumbnail size so we can see those a little bit better. And the first thing we're going to start out with is using the pen tool. And we're just going to draw out one simple leaf for right now. I'm going to start by clicking on the bottom and making sure we hold down on that so that we can get our handles on the side. And that gives us a little bit more manipulation when it comes to the material. And if we want to move these after we place them, we can just hold down the Control key, and then we can play with these different settings and not worry about creating new points. And we're just clicking to create new points. As you can see, without Control on, when we click to modify a point, it just creates a new point in our path, but we can hold down Control again and move that down if we need to. And I'm just going to lay out our simple shape now and just modify these. And if you notice, our color is also set to white right now. But that doesn't really matter, because what we're going to end up doing is just using a color overlay to modify the color. And I'm just going to drag this out. And we want to make it just a little bit thinner. And we want to make it a little bit pointier on top. And that looks like that should be good. So we can right mouse click on this layer now and go to rasterize. And of course we can't see anything because it's white, but we're going to double click on this shape 1 layer. It's going to pull up our layer style, and now we can do a color overlay. And with this color overlay, I'm going to select just a green color for right now, sort of a darker green, and we can always modify this a little bit later if we need to. But this is a good base starting color for what we're going to be working with. And now what I also want to do is get rid of the fact that we have this shape on here. If you wanted to, you could start out with just your color and create your path with a different color other than white. But personally, I like to draw out my shape first and then determine my color later. What I'm also going to do is and take a screenshot and capture this right now, which we can do in our history palette with this middle button. And what that'll do is capture the state that we're at right now, and we can see the snapshot. So we can always come back to this where we're at with our layers, because I'm going to be merging this down and compressing this layer style into the actual image. And the way we're going to do that is to create a new layer. And we're just going to drag this underneath, select our shape 1, and just merge down, which is Control E. And now that we have our basic leaf shape, we can go in and start painting in and editing some of our details. So to do that, what I'm going to use is our burn tool. And we want to make sure we're burning shadows. And I have our exposure set to 15%, which should be a nice small amount so that we can go over it a couple of times if we need it a little bit darker. But that way it's not too intense. So I'm just going to burn in the sides of this just to give us a little bit of depth. And so it starts to take a little more shape. And I'm just going to do this around our edges, and I'm going to boost up our diameter. And then go around the edges just a little bit more, but not actually touching the surface, because what this is going to do is just give us that very soft edge, so we don't necessarily even have to be dragging our brush over the surface, since we're using a very soft brush. You see we have our hardness down to 0%. And this looks like this should be good. So now we're going to take a look at the center, and we're going to paint in sort of a vein in there. And I'm going to create a new layer, just so we can separate this. We are going to be using the shape tool for right now, but I just want to have this layer ready for some of our other painting that we're going to be doing. But we're going to select under our shape tools and select our line tool. Now we might need to try this a couple of times to see exactly the amount of pixels that we're going to need, but I'm going to start out with 15 pixels, and I'm going to adjust our color now to a darker green, and click OK. And now if I hold down Shift and click from the top to the bottom, we can see our line is drawn out. And that actually looks like that's going to be the perfect pixel size. So we can rasterize this layer, and now we want to blend this in, and that way we get that nice little curve towards the center of our leaf. So we're going to use the blur tool, Gaussian blur, and then we can adjust this amount, making sure that we look at our actual image and we have preview selected so that we can see exactly what's happening with our leaf. We can just see that nice little definition starting to work out in the center there. And you just kind of want to adjust that to get to the point where you want it. And I'm going to click OK. And I also want to give us a little bit of a color change in there. So what I'm going to do is change this to a yellow, and sort of a mustard type yellow color. And I'm going to create a little bit thinner line. This time we'll use 10 pixels. We'll hold down Shift, start from around the top, and just drag it down. Right mouse click on our layer, and we can rasterize that. And if we need to, we can position it more towards the center. And I'm going to do the same thing as I did before, a Gaussian blur. And I'm going to reduce the blur this time, so it's not so far out. And then we're going to adjust the opacity of that, just to give us a tiny little hint of that color. So we'll grab our opacity and drag that down, just so we have that tiny little hint of the yellow in there. And of course you could blur that more if you want to, and it's all really personal preference. And if you feel like we've lost a little bit too much definition here, we could always create another thicker line and blur that as well, which I think I'm going to do, because it looks like with this yellow in here, we've actually lost a lot of our darkness that we had towards the center. So I'm going to go ahead and create another dark green line, and click OK. And on this time, I'm going to select, let's do 20 pixels. Hold down Shift, select from the top, and we can drag this down. Right mouse click on our layer, we're going to rasterize this. I'm also going to drag this underneath our yellow, and then I'm going to select our Gaussian blur once again. And we can adjust just a little bit more of that so we can get our shadows on the edges of that, and that also give us a little more depth in there. And click OK. And to make this a little more interesting, I'm going to be also drawing some more lines horizontally across our leaf. And you can also see that that layer I added before, it has disappeared, because if you make a blank layer and then use the shape tool, it will go away. But although when we use the shape tool by itself, it will add a new layer. So you don't necessarily need to add that layer, but sometimes it helps. So I'm, in this case, just going to leave it where we're at, and we're going to use the line tool again. You could personally paint this as well, and just hand paint that using a brush. But I'm going to use the line tool because I want it to be nice and uniform, and we can always adjust those layers and levels later. So I'm going to change this to a little bit smaller now, and we're going to go with a 7 pixel line, and we're going to create a couple of them. We're going to start from the bottom, and I'm using Shift just to constrain that so it stays nice and straight, and we don't have to worry about any angles. And I'm just going to drag and keep clicking, holding down Shift each time. And adding our lines. And once that's done, we can right mouse click on that layer, rasterize that, and then go back to our blur, Gaussian blur that, and we're going to need to reduce that just a little. We get that nice little hint of color in there. And to really, the crispness of that, if you wanted a little bit crisper, you could reduce your blur. If you wanted it to blend in a little bit better, of course, increase your blur. So it really depends on what sort of color you want to get out of your leaf. We can click OK because that looks fairly good. And what I want to do, since most of this major stuff here is done, and I'm going to keep this coloration where it's at, I'm just going to merge all of these layers down just so it's just have one constant layer. So we'll select our top shape 2, hold down Shift and select layer 1, and then we can merge down using Control E. And if we have to, we can do that once again, so we can see that top one was not selected. I also want to add sort of a tip to the end of this leaf where we'd have sort of dead area on the end, and we could just paint that in with a brown brush. But first, what we're going to do is adjust the coloration of this, because we want to have a nice blend to a different color, and that'll make it a little more interesting. So what I'm going to do is select our shape 2. I'm going to drag it down to the bottom right next to our little trash bin right there and create another layer. We're just going to copy that. And it creates a nice copy of our layer. And I'm going to use hue and saturation now on our copied layer. And we can adjust this to whatever color we would like this to fade to. So we could grab this to more to a red if we wanted, and then adjust our saturation. You can see it's a little more brown. And I'm going to select about right there. So we have a very, very red leaf in this case. But I want to blend from red on the bottom to green on the top. So what we're going to do is just use the eraser tool on this top layer now. And I'm going to right mouse click to make our diameter a little bit larger because we want a very soft blend. So the larger the brush, the better. And the hardness will need to be all the way down to 0. So I'm just going to start on the top and just start to erase this area down. And now in this case we have still a pretty harsh cutoff between the two colors. So I'm just going to go ahead and undo that. And I'm going to zoom out of our image a ways and make our brush a little bit larger. And this way what we can do is just start painting outside of our image so that we're not touching it. And we can get a little bit better of a blend this way. And we can see that is blending together a little bit nicer. I'm also going to decrease our opacity to 50% and just sort of work it in there a little. And now we have our nice little blend between the green to the red. If we wanted to, we could reduce that, take it down a little bit lower, but I'm going to keep it at that point right there, and that should be fine. So now we just want to create that little tip on the top, and I'm going to change to our brush tool. I'm also going to create a new layer on top of all of our other layers, and if we wanted to, what we could also do is merge these down if we needed to. And if we thought maybe the color was too intense, we could adjust our opacity to reduce that. So maybe it's not so red, and we just have a very subtle change. So it really, of course, that depends on what it is you would like to create. But this method works really well for nice color blends. All we got to do is just copy those layers. But I'm just going to go ahead and merge those down. And now we have our single leaf and one layer. And I'm going to select layer 1, which is our new layer that we just created. And I want to change our color to a nice brown. And we want it to be more on the gray side, because that'll be a little more realistic. We want to have a nice dead leaf color. And I'm just going to click OK then. And we're going to zoom in to the top part of the image. And I'm going to tone down the diameter of our brush just a little. Our hardness we want to make sure that we keep at 100% so that we stick with this very sharp line on the outside, because that's going to be very important when we're creating our clip map. And I'm just going to go ahead and paint this in now. And we can see that it is a little bit blurry on the sides, but not too bad. And I'm just going to show and just make a very rough shape here. And I can always edit this a little bit later and go with the eraser to clean that up. But I'm just going to really quickly paint and fill in this area. And now I can switch to our eraser tool, make sure that our hardness is at 100%, and adjust our diameter for that as well. And we can just go in here and erase that, making sure that we change our opacity back to 100%, so that we're not only erasing half of it. We can erase all of it. And I'm just going to shape this out, make it a little bit pointier on the end, and add that little bit of a curve in there. And we can zoom out and take a look at it. If we need to make any changes, we can. But that shape looks like it should be good. So now I'm going to switch back to our burn tool, change our diameter, and we just want to add a little bit of variation onto the edges and in various areas of this material, or this layer. So we can just randomly sort of paint in here. You can tell I sort of missed an area in there, but that should be alright. If you want, you can always fill that in. Make our brush size just a little bit smaller. We just want to add little variations here and there to give the appearance that the end of this leaf is dead, and that adds just a little bit of extra realism overall. We can zoom out. Another thing we notice is that this leaf doesn't look very real. One thing that'll increase it, the realism of this material, is adding a little bit of grain. So I'm going to select our shape 2, and I'm going to go ahead and copy that, just as we did before. And I'm going to go up to Filter, and we can use Noise, and Add Noise. And I want to make sure I select Gaussian, and we want to have monochromatic on, because we don't want to have all different types of colors being created in there. And I'm just going to adjust our noise a tiny bit. We don't have to go too much. But just so we have a very nice speckle in there. And I'm going to click OK. Now there's two things we could do at this point. We could either adjust our opacity and drag that down, so we just have that little bit of variation in there, very tight little speckles. Or what I can do is lock our transparency, and that way we keep all of our edges the same, and go up to our blur tool. If we're not using our lock transparency, this will blur our leaf outside of our rim and the edge, and we don't want to do that. So I'm just going to blur this a little just to add that little bit of extra variation in there, and click OK. And then we can adjust the opacity to sort of blend that in. And if you want something that's a little bit crisper, you can add some new lines to it. I'm just going to stick with this for right now, because this should look pretty good. I do want to adjust our contrast a little, though. So I'm going to go to Adjustments, and I'm going to go to Brightness and Contrast, and I can up our contrast. And I'm just doing this on our blurred layer, and not on our actual layer. And reduce our brightness, and click OK. And now it looks a little bit better. I'm also happy with the way this looks, and I don't think I'm going to be changing it. So I'm just going to go ahead and merge that down, Control E, and now we have just one layer for that. And I do want to keep our tip separate when we get to our specularity maps, and you'll see why a little bit later. But that can be a little bit important, so we do want to keep that separate. And there's two things we could do at this point. We could either use this leaf at this point and use it on a plant, which we could easily do, or we could add more to it, clone these leaves, make a couple more out of it, and also add some more interesting things to it, which is what I'm going to do. So the first thing I'm going to do is just take a snapshot, so we can always go back to this point. And in this case, it will be easier since we're going to be cloning and copying this leaf and making multiple copies. It will be easier to merge down our tip into our actual leaf. And as far as the specularity map, we can just do that manually. That won't be a major problem. But if we need to, we can always go back to our snapshots if you want to keep that layer. What we could also do is even make a copy of that layer and save it for later. But I'm just going to go ahead and merge that down, because creating a manual specularity map for that is not going to be all that big of a deal, and it's not going to take that long. There's another thing we could also do before I copy this. We made pretty much a very straight leaf, but if you were just to save this out by itself, or if we do want to make multiple copies and you want to edit this leaf a little bit more, we can right mouse click and go to Free Transform, and then right mouse click once again and go to Warp. And what this is going to allow us to do is just kind of manipulate our leaves. And we can make it a little bit wider. We could add a little bit of a bend to it if we wanted. And there's just different things we could do with it at this point. But I'm going to keep it fairly straight right now. And I'm just going to go ahead and copy this. And I'm going to right mouse click, free transform, and actually we can just go ahead and rotate that. And now if your image isn't wide enough, you can always change the canvas size, making sure that you don't change the image size. If you change the image size, it will stretch out our entire image. If we just change the canvas size, it will give us that extra little bit of room to work with. I'm just going to drag out a couple of extra leaves on the side here. One right there should be fine. And we can position it if we need to. I'm also going to drag that behind our other leaf. And then I'm going to go ahead and copy that, free transform, and flip that horizontally, and we can move that into the exact position on the opposite side. As you can see, we're touching the side over here and we're not quite centered. So I'm going to go ahead and select all of these layers and just move them over a tiny bit. I'm also going to turn off snap in this case, since we are snapping to the edge, and we don't want to do that. We want to just be able to position that in the center. And that should be more than enough room to work on this specific leaf. What we also want to do is modify these side leaves so they don't look exactly like the one through the center. And I'm going to be using free transform and warp for that. And what we can do is just kind of grab our edges and just click on certain areas within this warp, which will allow us to modify it. And as you can see, it's actually a lot easier to create bends in your leaves once it's tilted at an angle than it is to actually go straight up and down. And that's one of the nice things about the warp tool, is if we just do a little bit of a change right there, we can always rotate that back. Because when it came to, let's go ahead and take a look at that middle layer again with our warp. If we click on the center and try to move it, you can see we get some very interesting looking results. But if we do the same thing with this side leaf, free transform and hit warp, we can easily modify the shape and the curve of this leaf. So it's kind of a neat little tool and a neat little trick to doing that. It's just to give a little bit of tilt. If we want to modify that center one, we could just rotate it to the side and then make our warp modification and then just go ahead and rotate that back to the center. So I'm going to click enter to change that out. If we want to, we could also modify these tips, maybe make them a little bit different, but in this case I'm just going to stick with what I have. What I also want to do is make this plant a little more interesting. So I'm going to be adding some dead leaves in between some of our other leaves in the foreground of our image. So I'm going to go ahead and select our middle layer and our middle leaf and just go ahead and copy that. And I'm going to be using this just to make those dead leaves. So I'm going to right mouse click, free transform, and we can just scale this down. And I'm going to rotate that to the side just a tiny little bit. What we could also do is just use these smaller leaves and stick those in there as well, and that would also create a very nice variation. But in this case, I want to make these more of dead leaves. So I'm going to right mouse click on this, and we can free transform it and warp it once again. And I'm going to just modify our shape and make it look a little more gnarled. And we're going to be changing the color, of course. But it's a lot easier since we already have this shape designed. We don't have to worry about remaking another shape layer. So we can just use what we already have. And now I want to do a color overlay on this. So we're going to double click on our layer to pull up our layer styles. I'm going to select color overlay. And we want to set this to a darker brown. What we could also do is match this to the top with the eyedropper to get a brown material, brown color that's already within our scene. And then we can modify this leaf just like we did before with the burn tool to add a little bit of variation. But what I also want to do is sort of erase some of the sides and make it look like the leaf is a little more crumpled. So we'll grab our eraser tool. We want to make sure that the hardness is at 100%, and I'm going to adjust our diameter to fit whatever it is that we need. And then I can just go ahead and start to erase some of these edges and make it a little more interesting looking of a dead leaf and a little more realistic. So I'm just going to clip the edges here. I'm going to get rid of that top part so it's not so fine of a tip. And just remove these edges, compress that just a little. And that should be fine right there. And now we're going to switch to our burn tool, but first we need to merge this down since we're using a color overlay. So I'm going to select a new layer, create a new layer, put it underneath our layer that we have for our dead leaf, and I'm going to merge that down. And now our layer styler is removed, and we're just left with this dead leaf. We could also make these a little bit larger if we wanted, and the size really depends on what you want. But I'm going to switch to the burn tool now, and zoom in, and we can just start to add that little bit of detail in this layer. So I'm going to paint over this just randomly. It doesn't have to be anything specific, just something to make it look a little more erratic and a little more like a dead leaf rather than just a flat solid color. So go around the edges a little bit more, and then we want to go across the center just to give that illusion of that ripples and a nice little bit of depth in there. And we could also make this a little bit darker if we wanted, but I think I'm going to keep this where it's at. And I also noticed that we do have a very blurred texture in the background. So if we are going to be doing some high resolution renders and a little more close-up, then we might want to make that a little bit crisper. But if we're far away, as we can see at this point, it looks fairly good. And in view, most of it's going to look fairly good, especially with our bump maps on and things like that. That'll add to the crispness. But if you do need to make that a little bit crisper, you can add some extra layers and some smaller lines in there and blur them once again. And that'll create a very nice looking color. And that should be good for one of our dead leaves. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this. And we're going to create a couple of them. Free transform, flip horizontally. I'm going to do a little bit of a size change. Rotate that a little. Click enter. And we're just going to do this a couple of times, just to add that extra little bit in there to make it look more interesting. And if we need to too, we can always add that little more blur on each of the layers so they don't look exactly the same. Free transform it once again. I'm going to bring this one on the side, flip horizontally, so we're kind of curving down. And I'm just going to make two more that sort of extrude from the sides. And just copy that last one, flip it, and I'm just going to make this one come out just a tiny little bit. And that's going to make it a lot more interesting. And it doesn't look very realistic now, but once we actually get to the point where we're rendering it, it'll look a lot better. And I'd say our color map is pretty much done. And now we can start taking a look at creating our bump maps and our other maps for this specific leaf that we've created. I'm going to start out by taking another snapshot, so this way we can go back to the original color if you don't want to save right now. But one of the best things to do is just save out as you go. So we save out the color map, and then we can start modifying other materials. The bump map is going to be fairly simple, and we can actually use the color map for that. One thing we can do that's really quite easy is I'm just going to go ahead and flatten our image, and that'll get rid of all of our layers and just put it on one. And then what we can do is either desaturate this, we can go to Image, Adjustment, Hue and Saturation, and decrease our saturation all the way, and that'll give us one type of effect. But another thing we can do is go to Image, Adjustments, and we're going to use a gradient map, and select our gradient map, and I want to change this to black and white, and then we could always flip this back and forth if we needed to, reversing that. But as you can see, by using the gradient map and not just desaturating, we still have some of this definition in here. And it's just a little bit better of a way to create certain types of bump maps and gradient maps, really depending on the type of texture. So the best thing to do is try both and see what looks best. I'm just going to go ahead and cancel this out, but this is pretty much our bump map. If we wanted to, we could just go ahead and click OK, and then we have our bump and or diffusion. Depending on which way we want to have things going, we could go ahead and invert that, or we could just invert it within view. And now I'm going to go back and delete our flattened image from our histories. So we don't want to have that history state in there anymore. And it'll bring us back to our color with all of our different layers. And now we can start to modify these layers to create our specularity map. So the one thing I want to do for our specularity map is I'm going to go ahead and create a new layer on top of all these other ones. And we can just zoom in. And in this case, what I'm doing is just painting black. So I'm going to select color black, grab our brush, make sure the hardness is at 100%, and just grab the brush size that we need. And I can go ahead and just paint in around these dead areas on the top so that this has no specular value. And we don't have to worry about being very precise about how we paint this, just because we are going to have a clip map or an alpha map that's removing the outside areas, so we don't need to worry about that at all. And of course I could zoom in a little bit further if I wanted to be more precise, but this should be good and should demonstrate fairly well what I'm going to be doing. Since we have our dead leaves on another layer, we can go ahead and just change those. We can create another snapshot, and I'm going to turn off all of our other leaves in the background, and then select all of our dead leaves and go ahead and merge those down onto one layer. So we'll select all of those holding down Shift, starting at the top and then selecting the bottom, merge that down, and then we can double click on this layer for a layer style, do a color overlay, and change that to black. And now we have a specular map. So we'll have specularity on our leaves because that's within the white zones, and then everything that's in the black won't be shiny at all, which is how it should be because those are the dead areas. What I also should probably do is just fill in that little gap that we have right there. But that should be good, so we can go ahead and save this out as our specularity map. And now the last map we want to create is our clip map. So I'm going to go back to our merge layers and just delete that, turn off that painted layer we just created, and I can turn these other ones back on. And now the easiest thing to do for this specific clip map is just to merge everything down into one layer. So I'm going to go ahead, start at the top, hold down Shift, select our bottom, and we can merge that down. So now everything that's important is all on one layer. And I'm going to go ahead, and what we can actually do is we can either do the layer style with color overlay, but one thing that can be quicker is just to go to brightness and contrast, reduce those both down to -100, and then we're going to double click, and we're going to create either a stroke, or we can use an inner glow. Inner glow usually works a little bit better, because if you see with our stroke, we get some very interesting results. Even though we can change our stroke to an inside, and it'll look a little bit better. But sometimes what will happen is we get too sharp of lines. In this case, using stroke seems to work quite well, just as well as our inner glow would work. So we could either go back and forth, one or the other. We could change this color to white, and then we have pretty much our clip map. Or we could use our inner glow, just as we did before, change the opacity to 100%, change that to white, and adjust the choke, and then our size to clip that in however we need to. But I think we get more predictable results when using inner glow than when using our stroke, because sometimes with stroke we can get some very pixelated edges, and overall it just won't look very good. But we can take a look now and see that this looks fairly good. Doesn't look like it needs any adjustments. So we can go ahead and save this out. And this platen texture is pretty much done now. So we can switch over to view and take a look at all the different options and possibilities that we can create, all the different types of species and different combinations with different trees just by using this single texture that we just created. We're going to be using a variety of different plants to show what we can use that texture that we just created with. So I'm going to right mouse click on our plant option, and we're just going to load in a couple of different trees. The first thing I'm going to start out with is in the plant section, some of our single leaf plants. And we can use any number of one of these. This should be a good one. We can start out with this. And click OK. I'm going to zoom in and reposition our camera just a little so we can get a nice render of that. And now we want to load in the leaves that we just made. So I'm going to go ahead and double click on this and just quickly load in what we've created by selecting this little leaf underneath our material. And we can also see that this specific leaf is just created with an overall color map, and the shape of it is determined by a clip map. So you could also create leaves that way as well without actually having to specifically create just one area. We could create an overall leaf and then just use clip maps to make different shapes. But I'm just going to go ahead and load in those maps that we created before. So I'll load in our color. And I'm going to select to load in our clip or alpha map. And we also want to make sure we're rotating these 180 degrees. And we can move our starting point just a little bit into sort of our dead leaves and click OK. And now we can see we have a rather interesting looking plant. Because of our length and our width and the way it's set up, it doesn't quite match the way we made it. So we can just go ahead and adjust that. Reduce our length, increase our width, and now we have a fairly interesting looking plant where we have some of our dead leaves in there mixed in with all those alive leaves that we created. I'm going to reduce our length just a little. We could also adjust our curl to make that a little more uniform, and also our flexibility to change what type of plant we would like this to be, whether or not we want this to bend down, or we could have it go straight up, which is kind of a neat looking plant. And I'm just going to go ahead and curl this down a tiny bit and click OK. I'm also going to reposition our sun, go to our atmosphere editor, and I want to adjust our pitch to about halfway. And we can adjust the azimuth to change the position of our sun so that shadow is a little bit behind our plant, and click OK. I'm going to reposition our camera. We can go ahead and zoom in. And I'm just going to go ahead and render this right now without any of the other maps on, just to see what it looks like. Do a 640 by 480, a final render. I'll just go ahead and render that out. We can tell it looks pretty plain right now. It doesn't look very realistic. So we're going to go ahead and add those additional maps to it to make it look a lot more realistic. So go ahead and close this out. We're going to make sure we select our plant texture because this is our stem, but since we don't really see the stem too much in this specific plant, even though we have it sort of in the center, we don't really see that. So I'm going to edit our leaf map for this, double click, and we'll select our color in alpha, right mouse click, and go to edit function. And this way we can just add all of our different materials within the function editor. I'm going to go ahead and delete our bump, or we could just replace this. So we can go to our little arrow down here and add in our bump map that we created. We'll rotate that around, change our mapping mode to flat vertical so it matches our others. I also want to grab our highlight and add in our highlight map so we can add texture map node for that, which is going to look exactly like our bump map, and we can change that out with the specularity map that we made, or the highlight map. Rotate that around 180 degrees and click OK. What we also want to do is create that luminosity map as well, that Lumos map, so we don't have these really dark areas on the bottom, and we have sort of a little bit of fake translucency, just as we did before. So we'll click on our drive with function for our luminous, and I want to delete that constant that is attached to that. Or we could just click on this and also click the texture map node to remove that. But you can see that links us to time because of the constant. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that, delete the UV coordinates that were created, select our luminous again, and add that texture map node. As you can see, we're still selected and connected to time because we have an animation map selected. So I'm going to change that to texture map, And that disappears. We can also get rid of these UV coordinates because we don't need that. And I'm going to load in our same one as before as our specularity map. Change that to, actually we need to change this just a little bit more. You see we have a projected texture map, so we need to change that and rotate that around 180 degrees. Also want to change our mapping mode to flat vertical, so now we have the exact same thing that we had before with our highlight map. We also want to add that filter, just like we did in the other chapter, so that we can adjust our luminosity a little bit easier. So we'll select that line and click to add a filter node. I'm going to move these nodes out of the way. And we can edit that filter and just sort of drag that down. And if we click on our preview, that'll refresh and we can see it a little bit better. We can see that our dead leaves are not affected by our luminosity map at all, and neither are the tips. And that way it's a little more realistic. Unless, of course, you wanted to have a tiny bit of translucency in there. You could make that sort of a gray and not black like the way we had it for our map. And that should be good right about there. I'm going to click OK. And let's go ahead and render this out. And we have a little bit more of a realistic looking plant now. Of course, at this close, because of the way our texture was created, it still doesn't look all that great. But if we zoom out just a little bit more and apply this to maybe an ecosystem, it'll look definitely a lot better. So I'm going to go ahead and render this out so it's a little bit smaller, and we can see some of the finer details, how it would actually look in our scene. And we can see that looks pretty good. Click OK. And now what I want to do is just close that out, and we're going to load in a couple of more plants and just go ahead and drag this material onto their leaves so we can see what sort of things we can create with it. So we can grab a couple of different things. Grab our ficus, click OK. I'm going to move this off to the side, and we want to select our plant texture for that. But first, we need to go back to our original map that we created. Right mouse click, we can copy material, and then select our next one and go to that leaf texture and paste the material. And we'll go ahead and zoom in on this plant and see how that looks and do a render. And now by adding the leaves to this plant, we have created a very interesting looking plant in general. We can modify our stem if we want to match our colors. We could use bark if we wanted to kind of make this into a sort of a tree. And we can modify that however we want. But as you can see, it's very, very flexible, being able to use these different image maps for several different types of plants. We could also modify this in different ways. We could adjust the length and make a little short plant that's kind of the same as the other one before, but a little bit different. Modify the length a little bit more. We get a different type. Adjust our width, and our plants start to fill in a little bit more. We can gnarl that, adjust our flexibility, and really just modify this however we want our plant to look. And I'm just going to go ahead and load in another tree now. An actual tree this time, and I'm going to use the plum tree. And instead of using a single leaf, a typical plant with a single leaf texture, we're going to use this multiple one and see what sort of effects that we get out of it, because it will be kind of neat looking. So we'll go to our second material on our plum tree, our leaves, and we're going to paste that material. Also want to double click and make sure that our starting point is the same as before. And because we're copying it, it should pretty much stay the same, and we don't really need to worry about adjusting this. In this case, I'm going to bring it in a tiny little bit more because I do want these sort of going into the branches. But we do have that very flat surface on the bottom. Typically when you're working with this on a tree, you want to make sure that you have that so it goes to sort of a point or a stem, so it looks a little more realistic as it's touching the different branches. As you can see, we have a very interesting looking tree already, and I can adjust the length of our leaves, bring in the width maybe just a little bit more, and we just have these random little leaves on our branches, which looks pretty neat. So we can get a kind of an interesting looking tree out of it that way. I'm going to go ahead and move over to the side. We're going to add another tree in here. And this time I want to use something a little bit denser. So I'm going to be using the summer cherry tree, which is a very dense service, has a lot of repeating of our leaves in there. I'm going to move our camera off to the side so we can get our handle and just move that over. And we want to select our leaf texture, grab our leaves, and just paste that in. And now you see we have a larger tree with a lot of these leaves in there that we've created. And we can go ahead and change that and modify that as well. As you can see, these are a little too big for this tree, so we can adjust our length, maybe our width, and make that look a little bit different. And modify that point once again. And then, as you can see, all of our leaves are sort of curling upwards, so we can adjust the flexibility, make it go up a little bit higher, or make it start to go down. And it's really up to you how you want to modify this. What we could also do is adjust our fall off and our length of our tree, and maybe the diameter and the gnarl, and we can get a lot of different tree types out of this. And just by customizing even the same species of plant and using different types of leaves, we can create so many different types of trees for your scenes. You can see our bark on the bottom there, and our trunk is starting to look a little interesting. We start to get some unexpected results. We'll adjust our fall off for that, our droop. You can see we could just get so many different possibilities out of even the same leaf and so many different types of trees. We could just apply this to anything that we want to. So it's very, very cool. And that about wraps it up. So I hope you enjoyed the tutorial and you learned something about creating custom trees. And I hope you're able to expand your creativity a little bit more and create some better looking scenes. And hopefully now you won't feel so constricted and confined by what is available within Vue, because really you can go ahead and do whatever you want with it. And all the species that come with are very, very flexible, and you can virtually create any single plant that you wanted to with a combination of Photoshop and Vue or any image editing program that you're using.